Welcome. Oh, thank you already. Yeah, it is great to have you all here today for the Arnold Newman Lecture, History and Memory in the American Landscape, with Dawoud Bey and Amanda Bock. My name is Linnea West. I work in public programs here, and I'll begin by acknowledging the land we are on. The Philadelphia Museum of Art recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the walking purchase of 1737, displaced many Lenape from this land. The museum and its staff strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to the Lenape people and their vibrant communities today, including the federally recognized nations Delaware Tribe, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. Today's conversation is the annual Arnold Newman Lecture. The Arnold Newman Lecture provides a forum for leading photographers to speak about their practice, and we are honored to have groundbreaking artist and MacArthur Fellow Dawoud Bey here with us today for a conversation about history and memory in the American landscape. Our thanks go to the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation for the support that makes this program possible. To tell you just a little bit about our distinguished guest speaker, Dawoud Bey examines the Black past and present in photographs and film installations that have been exhibited widely throughout the United States and Europe. Bey's work has been the subject of numerous solo museum exhibitions, such as Dawoud Bey Street Portraits at the Denver Art Museum, Dawoud Bey An American Project, organized by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art, and Elegy at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and New Orleans Museum of Art. His work has been the subject of several monographs, including Elegy, which chronicles Bey's history projects and his landscape-based work. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including 5 honorary doctorates, and in 2024, the artist was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Currently a critic at Yale University, where he received his Master in Fine Arts, he is Professor Emeritus at Columbia College, Chicago. And for this afternoon, Dawoud will be in conversation with Amanda Bock, the Philadelphia Museum of Art's Lyndon Harold Honickman Assistant Curator of Photographs. Their conversation will focus on his landscape photographs, and so I'll just flag for you that we have an example of one on view right now from the series Night Coming Tenderly Black. It's on view in Gallery 276 as part of an exhibition titled What Times Are These? So I encourage you after our talk today to make your way to Gallery 276 and see this really stunning photograph. So just a few notes then before I hand things over. Please, if you have not already, silence your cell phone. Maybe you think you've already done it, but just double check. The program will last about an hour, and we're saving time as part of that for Q&A. We're going to pass mics, these mics, for Q&A, and we ask that you wait for the mic and then speak into it so that both everybody in the room can hear you, but also for our Zoom audience so they can hear you. So all of that said, please join me in welcoming Dawoud Bey and Amanda Bock to the stage.
Thank you all so much for joining today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the museum. So Dawoud, you've put together an incredible PowerPoint for us today, and it opens with this quote by Christina Sharp from her book, In the Wake, which I've just started reading after looking through this slide presentation. And it seems like a question that she has asked kind of at the same historical moment as you are asking it in your work. And I think about this as sort of maybe a moment where people are widely grappling with this question. And I wonder sort of how you came to discover her writing and how we can think about her words in tandem with your pictures.
Well, first, thank you for the invitation to be here. And thank all of you for coming out this afternoon. You know, I make my work as a way of provoking a conversation. And for the past 12 years, a conversation about history. American history, I should say. American history in relation to the African American presence in that history. As a way of bringing the past into a contemporary conversation, because the past is always with us, and the answer to our present and contemporary set of social dilemmas actually resides in the past. And so my work is meant to provoke that conversation through photographs and also moving images. There are multiple conversations that my work is engaged in, but that is primarily what I'm focused on now. And doing that within the history of the medium that I work within the history of photography.
Yep. So we're looking at 4 of your series today, and the first of those, the Birmingham Project, for you really began actually looking back in history to this book, The Movement, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your engagement with this text and these images within it.
Well, this book, The Movement, is actually the beginning of all of the history-based projects that I've done. The book, and in particular, this image of Sarah Jean Collins in the book that I first saw when my parents brought this book home. James Baldwin was doing a talk at our church that I guess they thought I was too young to go to the talk. I don't know how much it would have meant to me. But after Baldwin's talk, this book, which was published by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was being sold after Baldwin's lecture, probably as a fundraising vehicle for SNCC. And they brought this book home and left it on the coffee table where I could see it. They didn't tell me that I have to look at it, because this book came out in 1964, so I was 11 years old. So I don't think that they told me to look at it. I might have, but left to my own wits, at some point I looked at this book, and it's a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement and era, with text by the writer and playwright Lorraine Hansberry. And there are some pretty horrific photographs in the book, including lynching photographs, and this photograph of Sarah Jean Collins lying wounded in a hospital bed after the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And I saw this image without consciously intuiting that the reason it was having such a strong effect on me was that I was pretty close to the age of the girl in the photograph. And this photograph haunted me for decades. It was part of a periodically recurring nightmare that I would have with this image. And one morning, I would say maybe 40 years later, maybe even 50 years, I don't know, but this image came flashing back to me. And I sat bolt upright in bed. The force of this image coming back, I sat bolt upright in bed, and there was this image. So I knew I had to go to Birmingham. I knew that although I may have parked this in my psyche somewhere, it had now come back, and I needed to do something with that. So with this image begins my going to Birmingham, and then continues the history-based work from there.
Had you been to Birmingham before this project?
Well, the exhibition of this work took place almost exactly 50 years to the date of the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And when I went to Birmingham for the first time, I had never been to Birmingham before. I had no relationship to Birmingham. But I had been doing a number of museum-based projects in terms of having an idea, approaching a museum to see if they would be a potential partner in this idea, coming back for an extended period of time to make the work, and then ultimately doing an exhibition of the work. So after my first visit to Birmingham, I got in touch with the Birmingham Museum of Art. I didn't know anyone there. I introduced myself, made another visit down to talk to them about an idea that wasn't even yet the photograph. It was just an idea that I need to come here and make some work. If you ask me what that work would be, I have no idea, but I'm asking you if you want to perhaps support what might come out of it. And they did, and that began several years of visiting Birmingham before I came to this idea of what became these diptychs, making photographs of young people who are the ages that those 6 young people were who were killed in Birmingham that day, 4 girls and later 2 boys, which felt incomplete to me conceptually. I wanted to make something that really resonated with the force of that history, which was when I decided to also make portraits of adults who were the ages that those young people would have been, and then pairing them in a diptych form so that each photograph embodied 50 years. That was a huge conceptual breakthrough for me, this idea of embodying the past and the present in a single photographic object. So when it was completed, the first place that the work was exhibited was at the Birmingham Museum of Art.
And one of the things that's remarkable to me about this series is the way that it does kind of harness time in a different way than photography usually does, which is, as soon as you take a picture, it's in the past.
Yep.
And in this case, that is true, but also it is bringing several pasts together into a dialogue. So we have in the diptychs a child who I'm sure knows about the Birmingham bombings but did not witness it, and an adult who, given their age, probably, if they were raised in Birmingham, had encountered this firsthand.
Yeah. And that idea about photography and time, which is usually, we think of a photograph at either the present, the moment it's made, but as soon as it's made, it does begin to become its own past. But with this work, conceptually, I wanted to embrace this idea and answer the question of how does one make work about history and the past, but in the contemporary moment, and to create something that, for me, occupies what I would call the liminal space in between the past and the present, and to strongly evoke both. It's this moment and it's that moment. So this idea about liminality, making photographs that are rooted in history but take place in the contemporary moment begins with the Birmingham project.
And one of the other things that is so striking about these pictures that I didn't initially notice at first, but the longer I looked, the more I saw, is how carefully you are at framing your subjects. And I look at these and I think back to a history of art, particularly to paintings of the Renaissance when there is this sort of trompe l'oeil of someone leaning sort of outside a frame and entering your own space. And I think the way that you've posed these subjects sort of peering into our space over this pew really brings a direct and formal connection between your sitters and with your viewers.
Well, I've been making photographs that we consider portraits for a very long time, starting with my first project, which I began in 1975. And these were actually the last portraits that I made on the way to the landscape work. But this idea of making a psychologically resonant photograph of an individual who is engaging with the world through the lens, because they're not looking at me, they're looking at the lens. So in making these portraits, I've become a kind of director, directing them to what I would call a heightened performance of themselves. The gestural behavior comes mostly from my observing them while I'm setting up the camera, the lights. And I take a little longer than necessary because I want them both to get comfortable there. And I'm taking notes of how they sit after I have them sit in the church pews or in the chairs. So that comes, when we begin to make the photograph, I have a sense of their gestural behavior and how I can very subtly shape that to the photographic space, to that four-sided frame, how to shape that behavior to the frame in a way that resonates with all of the credibility of it being their gesture. And making all of the process, the camera, the tripod, the lights, my assistant, momentarily making all of that disappear so that they are in a space that for me reveals none of that but a kind of rich interiority.
I think that definitely comes through looking at these portraits. And the space of the church, to me, and probably to our audience, feels like a natural place to be making these portraits. And then the other part of the Diptych series is in a museum. And I'm so curious to hear what that space is like for the community that you're photographing, how moving this into the space of a museum impacted the kinds of portraits you're making or the engagement you're having with your subjects.
Well, the choice of location had to do with wanting to represent two different pieces of Birmingham's social history. The communal space of the Black church, and then the once segregated space of the Birmingham Museum of Art. Because during the time of the 60s, the 50s and 60s, and since the institution was built, like most Southern institutions, it was a segregated institution. And Black people could not legally enter the Birmingham Museum of Art until the museum, under pressure, created a day that they called Negro Day, when African Americans could, in a segregated context, visit the museum. So I wanted to have those two pieces of Birmingham's social history, the segregated public space and the communal space of the Black church, be the narrative that wrapped itself around the subjects for this project. Knowing full well, for example, that these photographs of African Americans made in a place that they previously could not even inhabit legally, and showing them in that space in life size in this moment, that was part of the whole construct of what the project was. The project was the photograph, but the project was also engaging the institution in a conversation around its history and around the larger history of segregation. And finally, the church is the church where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference came into being under the minister, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. So that church has its own highly significant place in the history of the civil rights movement in Birmingham. And
you've made a film as well that relates and sort of overlaps with this project, and I'm curious in a very general sense, since film seems to run in tandem with your still photography projects from here forward, really, how you see the relationship between the two, if you want to talk, generally, or about this film in particular. Are these projects that you think about in conversation with one another? Are they separate endeavors that are trying to achieve different things? Or how did you, even decide that film was a medium you wanted to start exploring in depth?
Yeah, well, I guess for a long time, I was a closet filmmaker. I took film.
A lot of photographers are.
I was a photographer who was a closet filmmaker. And I say that because I took film classes throughout grad school with an amazing filmmaker that I hope some of you know, Michael Romer. Michael Romer was my film teacher throughout grad school. I knew his work from Nothing But a Man, and I just recently, last week, he has two of his films from the 70s screening at Film Forum. But anyway, I took film every semester with Michael Romer, and I left grad school with a flat file full of these films that I only ever showed in class. But I've had a long and ongoing history with filmmaking that I finally decided to embrace as an active and, I guess, public part of my practice. It's two different ways of getting at a particular subject, two different material ways of engaging it, because along with the moving image, I also have, with all of my films, a sonic component. And I come out of a background in music. I was a musician and a drummer before I was a photographer. So the sonic piece of it is very important. So film allows me to engage with that piece, as well as to think about other ways that history can be visualized, not just through the still photograph, but with the moving image. And to still, with the moving image, invoke a sense of the past.
And this brings us to landscape, which is an abrupt change of pace and subject for you. So you've been, as you said, you've been working with portraiture for decades. What was it like to make that leap? How did that work?
It was very, very very difficult.
In what way?
It was basically, I guess, like learning to speak another language and then learning to speak it well enough to become expressive in that language, not just to speak it in a kind of pedestrian way. Even though, to be honest, my engagement with the entire history of photography has been pretty deep. I'm familiar with landscape photographs going all the way back to the 19th century, Western landscapes. I know that work. Ironically enough, my advisors in grad school was Frank Golke and Joel Sternfeld, who work in the landscape tradition. But after the Birmingham work, I wanted to continue this engaging with history, and I wanted to begin to look more at place, history in relation to place and the landscape, as opposed to continuing and trying to figure out how to wrap that around the idea of the portrait. You know, there didn't seem to be a way forward with that after Birmingham. The Birmingham project suggested that because there were 6 young people who were killed, which gives that a human dimension and context. The first landscape work that I did, actually I made some photographs in the streets of Harlem. That was the Harlem Redux work, color urban street landscapes. That was my tradition. That was my transition away from the human subject. And it was initially deeply frustrating and difficult. As I said, very difficult. Also because I changed cameras. I had been using the view camera and then a medium format camera that also had a ground glass photographing through the lens, you know. And I always tell my students, if you're going to make a change, you should generally make one change at a time. It's like if you're conducting an experiment. In order to understand why something's happening, you can only change one element at a time. If you change 2, and I changed subject and camera, and it put me in a very bad, very dark place. But eventually, I just kept pushing forward until I began to see the kinds of photographs that I was imagining. But it was very difficult. I got so dark one day, I thought I might have come to the end of the road. Maybe this is it. I've had a good career. You know.
You found a road out, though.
No, all of it is to say that the transition from the portraits, which I have a very deep kind of engagement and understanding with, and the landscape, as much as I might know the landscape theoretically and I know the history, the actual making of that kind of work was something that I think, it took me at least a year to kind of figure that out and then to feel comfortable enough making these photographs for A Night Coming Tenderly Black.
Yeah, so situate us here. We're in Ohio, yes? And along the Underground Railroad. And how did you approach this subject? Like, walk us through this project a little bit. Give us an overview.
Well, this project came about through a commission with the Front Triennial. They invited me to make some work for that triennial. And I told them I could only do that if I could find a piece of history in Cleveland, where the triennial was based. in order to keep thinking through the ideas that I was working through and to come up with something that was also related to the regional idea of that. And then once I did some initial research and realized the prominent place of the Underground Railroad in northeastern Ohio, that's when I agreed to do the work. Started making visits in preparation for photographing. And also, it's, I don't know what you guys are seeing on large screen, but another piece of this work that was very important was to materially create a sense of this act of African American fugitivity under cover of darkness. The exhibition prints of this work, including the one that's in the exhibit upstairs, they're very dark. They weren't made at nighttime, but they're printed to suggest this kind of fugitive movement under cover of darkness. And the work, Night Coming Tenderly Black, was inspired. My conceptual inspiration was Langston Hughes' poem, Night Coming Tenderly Black Like Me. This idea of night coming tenderly black like me, that the darkness and blackness could be something tender. Then I started to think about the Underground Railroad as a kind of tender embrace of these fugitive African Americans moving through the landscape. And then, materially, I thought about Roy DeCarava's photographs, which are, I'm sure some of you know DeCarava's work. A lot of them are they're very dark. The way he uses blackness as both narrative subject and in the photographic object itself. So those two things were the inspiration in terms of conceptually and materially how to approach this work.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think is so moving about this work is the fact that darkness is so tender, that there's a solace and safety there where, which we're seeing in these pictures, and I think we'll get to it, but I find that especially in the last image in the series of Lake Erie, where there are things like a body of water with no end in sight, or a thick bramble of trees that in other contexts you might focus on apprehension or the danger or the difficulty of that journey, and here it becomes very soft, and it becomes a space of solace and of safety.
All of these photographs are made from an eye-level vantage point, because I wanted to imagine that space as if through the eyes of those fugitive, formerly enslaved African Americans who were moving through that landscape, trying to imagine what that might have looked like, trying to make photographs that embodied that human experience of positionality and the way the landscape presents itself as you're trying to move through that landscape furtively and undercover, taking cover behind a tree, not just approaching what in that narrative would have been one of the houses that they called the Underground Railroad stations, where fugitive African Americans could take refuge on the way to Lake Erie and then on to presumed freedom in Canada. So they're meant to be thought of as using the lens as the eyes of the imagined subjects.
Yeah, and I don't think that slides ever do justice to an actual photograph. So do go upstairs and have a look when this talk is over. But just to touch on a little bit about what you said about the darkness of these images and also a little bit about the scale. So these are, especially if you're encountering them in a museum context where we have very low light levels to preserve artworks and things are behind plexiglass. These images are really dark in a way that involves actually kind of acclimatizing to looking at them. So sort of in the way where if you suddenly walk into a dark theater, you have to let your eyes adjust to the light a little bit. It's the same with these photos. And they're printed at a scale that is just big enough that you really need to get close and you become fully absorbed in that space.
You become enveloped in the experience, which is why they're made at the scale that they are. Both the scale and the darkness is meant to pull you into a very intimate and close engagement and experience of the place. Because if you stand close enough to it, within your field of vision, everything else is kind of blocked out. And the only thing you're seeing is this thing that you're trying to see through. So scale is very important and intentional in all of this landscape work, because I'm trying to suggest some of the physicality of the geography of the landscape to create physical space in the picture. And also, I should say, beginning with the Birmingham work, because the project before that, Harlem Redux, was in color, because it was about a very contemporary set of circumstances, a community in the midst of change due to the forces of globalization and gentrification, and it's happening right now. This history-based work, but the Birmingham work, I decided from the outset to make this work in black and white, because black and white is the material of photography's history. It's not a large-scale color photographic object, which is a very contemporary thing. They are large-scale, but the black and white, because of the materiality. So this work is also really had me thinking very much about the photograph as an object, the photograph as a material thing, because I think we often think about photographs as a picture of something or someone. We don't necessarily think about it as a very particularly made object. That's not necessarily the language that's most often applied to photographs. But photographs are as made an object as any other kind of art object. And to me, that suggests that there should be some degree, high degree, of intentionality around the making of it, scale, how they're made, what material is used in the making. So I'm very interested in this conversation around photography and photographs as a very particularly made kind of object that is meant to evoke a kind of visceral response, but that response being one of being drawn into a place that's the past, even though you know you're here in the present, but there's no evidence of that present in the photographs themselves.
Here's the Lake Erie image that I was talking about earlier. And this is the first really of a group of 3 projects that you've done that are investigating or really, I would say, imagining a historical landscape. And we'll look at the second one now, In This Your Place, which I'd love for you to sort of situate us where we are, both in time and in place. And then I have a question about this photo after that.
Well, no, what happened after the Birmingham work, the Birmingham project ended up becoming the most contemporary of these projects in terms of the history that it engages. And then Night Coming Tenderly Black, I wanted to, after that project, begin to trace my way back into the history with the plantation landscapes being the place from which enslaved people were making their escape or self-liberation, either toward Lake Erie or other points. So I began to think back into the history, using the Underground Railroad and fugitivity as a starting point. And then the question about what were they in flight from? Well, they were in flight from this landscape, from the plantation landscape. And I spend a lot of time in New Orleans. New Orleans is kind of like my get off the radar, hideaway place.
I don't know, after spending an afternoon with you, I don't think you hide anywhere.
I would disappear for a few days and go to New Orleans and just relax, have some good food, go to New Orleans Museum of Art. I have a whole community of friends there. But I was there so often, I started to want to make some work there. I wanted to look at the history of New Orleans and Louisiana in relation to the project of slavery in America. And so I made a visit to this particular plantation, Evergreen Plantation, which is the most intact plantation landscape in America. All of the cabins, all of the buildings, everything still sits there as it was in its original construction in 1700s. I began doing research, and at one time in this area, along the west bank of the Mississippi River and along what came to be called River Road, there were upwards of 350 plantations along that road, which, of course, suggests the enormity of the slavery project. That was just 350 in this particular location, and Evergreen being the oldest. And I ended up making photographs on the landscape of 5 different plantations, but mostly Evergreen, since it was the most intact and the one that was most deeply haunted by its history because nothing had been moved. Most of the other ones were constructed landscapes to more or lesser degrees, but the presence that still lingers at Evergreen became the place where I wanted to make work about that history. And again, keeping the camera at eye level, not moving the camera with an eye towards making interesting photographs compositionally, but viewing the geography of the landscape, both materially and experientially, trying to recall what this landscape this now uninhabited landscape looked and felt like at the time that it was both built and inhabited by enslaved African Americans. Because I think that piece of the narrative gets lost too. The fact that enslaved African Americans built the plantations on which they were enslaved. They weren't brought over and they moved into the plantation. They built the places of their own enslavement.
Right, and when I look at this series, especially moving from the last one, the fact that we've moved back into daytime is one thing that indicates to me that thinking about labor is an important part of this work. I did want to talk about this tree because I know that you've said that you have moved from portraiture to landscape, and when I was looking through this series, the first thing I thought was, oh, there's a portrait. Because this tree looks, by the scale of it in this picture, enormous and therefore very old. And it's an aspect of this place that has really borne witness to many generations, it seems. And I just wondered, am I wrong? Like, are you thinking about? Okay.
No. In traditional West African culture, trees are considered very sacred. They're considered to hold all of that history, much the way this tree on this plantation is. This is a particularly old tree, and that tree is the keeper of a lot of history. That tree has lived through an extraordinary amount. So I wanted to make both a photograph of that particular tree and then to contextualize it in terms of its place physically on that particular plantation landscape. But trees are very significant.
And I'm just going to scroll through a few more images and ask another question. I think this is the one where I sat and thought, where it really occurred to me that I had been looking at eye level throughout this entire series and throughout the one before. There's something about this peering over a fence that really brought that vantage point into focus for me. I did want to ask what I think is a little bit of a tough question about this series, which is about the idea of beauty in landscape. Because it feels like looking at these, they're gorgeous images of often very beautiful landscape where very ugly things have happened in the past. And I wonder, for me, a way to kind of reconcile that would be to think about the resilience and survival that also happened on that landscape. But I wonder how you, as the artist, reconcile this idea of beauty in your work.
Yeah, that's one of the tensions inherent in the work, to make a beautiful object about something whose history is quite ugly. And to use that beauty as a kind of subversive device to pull the viewer into the other conversation, but to make something that compels you to look at it for a sustained period of time, something that seduces the eye, and the imagination. And then as you keep going, you hopefully get to the question beyond that of what exactly is this landscape? What exactly happened here? So, I don't know how to make ugly pictures. I don't know how to make ugly pictures, but I can make beautiful pictures about things that are deeply meaningful and in some cases deeply problematic. People don't like to look at ugly things. You guys like to look at ugly things? I don't. But beauty does not necessarily subvert a deeper conversation. So, and I'm also working very much, on the one hand, in the landscape tradition, in which I'm very familiar with the forms and the horizon and the expanse of skies and the deep sense of space from foreground to background. I've kind of internalized all of that. But like any language, I think language doesn't dictate what you talk about.
Yep.
I mean, you think about that. Language doesn't dictate what you talk about. You know, we all speak English, but it doesn't dictate what we use that language to talk about. And I think photographic histories and the forms embedded in those histories can be used in a radical kind of way, too, to make photographs that are in some ways both in conversation with those histories, but also deconstruct those histories and use those histories and languages to talk about something else. Because if we think about the Western landscape photographs that are largely uninhabited, when in fact the West was not uninhabited, and how those photographs became the visual component of what became the manifest destiny, you know, for inhabiting and consuming and taking ownership of presumably uninhabited spaces that were not at all uninhabited. So even the history that we think about in terms of the history of landscape photography is built on a very insidious kind of proposition. And it's not an aesthetic one. It became an aesthetic language, but it wasn't an aesthetic proposition in terms of how those images were used.
No, it was a very political one, for sure. I just want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm going to move us to the last of these three landscape projects, Stony the Road.
If you guys don't mind, I don't know if you're bucking and rearing to ask questions.
No.
But,
we'll keep talking.
We
don't
can keep talking. I don't know how
We're
much
gonna
time
keep
we
talking.
have. I don't know how much time we have in terms of flexibility. But if it's okay, we'll keep going. Maybe we'll have time for a question or two.
Right.
But I don't want to suddenly slam on the brakes.
No, we're not slamming the brakes.
So let's keep going.
All right, let's keep going.
Let's have fun. Let's keep going.
So this is your most recent project, Stony the Road. And this, again, I think is looking even further back to the very beginning, really. And I wonder, again, if you can kind of situate us. We're in Virginia now. Where are you making these photos? How did you arrive here?
Well, again, it goes back to the idea of continuing to trace back into the history. And Virginia, in this case, Richmond takes us back to the beginning of the enslavement project. Virginia is where the enslaved engagement of Africans, who then became at that moment African Americans. This is where African Americans, enslaved Africans, begin to inhabit by force the American landscape. So as I continue tracing my way back because if you think about it going forward, if you go from here to the plantations to fugitivity, I kind of work my way backwards into the history, to the beginning. And so this work began as a commission by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Valerie Cassell Oliver, the modern and contemporary curator there, was very familiar with my work. And she knew the history-based projects that I'd been doing. And so she thought I might want to come to Richmond, Virginia, to think about making work there, since Virginia was the epicenter in the, what you might call, import and export industry of slavery. So I made an initial visit to Richmond to look around, to visit the church where the Second Congressional Convention was held, where the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, where that phrase, "give me liberty" or "give me death," was uttered. All of the profound contradictions and formations of American history kind of have their place in Virginia. And Valerie invited me to take a walk on the Richmond Slave Trail. And once I visited this landscape, I knew I wanted to make work there because quite remarkably, this may be maybe 4-foot wide trail along which upwards of 350,000 enslaved Africans were walked into slavery. That path is still visible. And when you stand there, you're standing on the site of profound and horrific history. And so at the invitation of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, I decided to take on a project of making photographs on this site, because this is, if we think about Birmingham as the most contemporary aspect of the profound disregard for black bodies, you know, that disregard for black bodies that led to those 6 young people being killed has its beginnings in this landscape. You know, I always, you know, history isn't a mystery. You know, if you know how things began, history explains itself. The contemporary moment is explained in that history. And so I spent several months in Richmond photographing on this trail. And also, again, after I was done photographing, I put together a film crew in Richmond. There's a studio there, Spang TV. And then I also brought in the cinematographer who I'd worked with on my first video work at Evergreen, Bon Moyi, and we put together a crew and also made what became a 2-channel film work in this same landscape.
One of the things that looks to me as a non-photographer is very challenging about this project is that you're working in such a confined and narrow space as compared to other places you've made landscapes before. And that, as you noted, the path was about 4 feet wide, maybe at its widest, and it's long, but you know, thick with brush and narrow. And how did you approach photographing this space that's so different from other places you had worked before?
It was a difficult challenge, especially because it's only about 4 feet wide and only 3 miles remains of the trail. So unlike being able to move around in 5 different plantations, it was a very restrictive space, which really forced me to see that much more deeply into the geometry and the structure of the landscape in intimate detail. It was only from going back repeatedly every day over several months and just continuing to look, going back at different times of the day, trying to really see something other than the trail in the center and it's going this way, just to really look into what that landscape is made of, and then to turn that into some kind of compelling form in relation to the human narrative of enslavement and bodies, black bodies moving through this landscape. But it was a very, very different kind of challenge, for sure.
And I think one of the things that I get a sense of from this is that it's a very kind of fragmented looking, right? You can't capture the sort of breadth of the space. You're penned in often on two sides, although once in a while we get a sort of glimpse through the brush at water. And it feels like a very apt way to, I mean, this is a very familiar landscape to me as someone who grew up on the East Coast of the United States. But I think in your photographs it becomes harder to parse and a little unfamiliar. And I mean, to me, that seems precisely like what you were aiming to achieve, because that would mirror perhaps the unfamiliarity and foreignness of this landscape to the people who are unwillingly being marched through it.
Yeah, and I think, it has to do with thinking about different scalar geographies within the landscape, even within this enclosed landscape that moves forward into what, for those who were walking it, an unknown experience, an unknown landscape, unknown experience, and trying to find different visual and photographic ways of translating the scalar differences in the landscape, trying to engage the idea of distance, distance here, distance there, really trying to explore the ideas of visual representation in relation to the narrative. These tangled branches that seem to impede on the trail and having to move through them. This idea of movement through intrusion, the harshness of this landscape that these enslaved Africans were being moved through. It's just about going back every day and doing the work, I guess, the work of looking and translating, looking and seeing, and the larger narrative into photographs. It's not anything I could just parachute in for a week and do, stay a week and then go back. It's months of looking, reconsidering, and trying to imagine the black bodies in this space and how I can interpret that and visualize that through the camera, including this kind of vortex. Like one time I went, and because of the quality of light and the curved branches, it actually looked like a vortex sucking you into it. You just have to be alert and do the work.
And I want to wrap up by looking at this installation view. So this project is on view in New York at Sean Kelly Gallery currently, and here's a good look at the film that accompanies the still photographs. And I have not been yet, but the screen looks massive, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how the film and photographs are in dialogue in this space, and what the kind of experience of seeing this film is in relation to the images we've looked at.
Yeah, the exhibition, for those of you who want to make a trip into New York, it's up at Sean Kelly Gallery until February 22nd. It's the photographs, Stony the Road, and then the 2-channel film, 350,000. And I've transformed the space in order to heighten the emotional and psychological experience of the exhibition. I won't say more than that. I don't want to give everything away, but if you want to go see it, please do.
I'll leave this up because this is an amazing quote from Baldwin and also a good synopsis of the journey we've been on today. And I'm so thankful and honored to speak with you for this time. And everyone, please join me in thanking Dawoud Bey.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that was going to take some time.